Sometimes the greatest blessings come wrapped in the smallest packages. Sometimes all it takes is faith when everyone else has given up. Elias Ward was a mountain man in Silver Creek who'd lost nearly everything to a brutal winter. His herd, his savings, his hope. At a spring auction, folks laughed when a dying foal was brought out. Ribs showing, barely standing. 50 cents to anyone fool enough, the auctioneer said. Elias stepped forward and dropped his last 2 quarters in the man's hand. That scrawny foal became Grace, the fastest mare in the territory. She would win races, carry Elias to fortune, and prove that miracles don't always announce themselves with trumpets. But how does a broken man and a dying horse become a legend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains around Silver Creek held their secrets close. The way old friends keep confidences. Elias Ward had lived among these peaks for 43 years, and in that time he'd learned that the land gave only to those who respected its terms. His cabin sat in a clearing halfway up the northern ridge, where the pine trees grew so thick that winter storms lost their fury before reaching his door. Sarah had loved that about the place, the way it felt protected, like cupped hands around a candle flame. She'd been gone 3 years now. 3 years since the midwife had come down from the mountain, with her eyes already telling the story her mouth couldn't form. 3 years since Elias had buried his wife and the son he'd never heard cry, under the cottonwood tree where they'd carved their initials as newlyweds. The cabin still smelled like her sometimes, especially in the mornings when the sunlight came through the kitchen window at just the right angle. Lavender and wood smoke and something else he could never name but would recognize until his dying day. Elias rose before dawn most mornings, the way mountain folk do, when habit runs deeper than reason. He'd light the stove, put coffee on to boil, and stand at the window watching the darkness lift off the valley below. Silver Creek was down there somewhere, a collection of wooden buildings and dirt streets where 200 souls made their living from the land and each other. He could see smoke rising from chimneys on clear days, thin grey lines connecting earth to sky. Before the winter of 1887, Elias had run a modest operation, 20 head of cattle, half a dozen horses, enough to get by with dignity intact. He'd sold beef to the butcher in town, hired himself out for packing and guiding when hunting season came around. It wasn't prosperity, but it was honest work that let him sleep sound at night. Sarah had kept chickens and a vegetable garden, canned preserves that lasted them through the cold months. They'd talked about children, about building a bigger house when the time was right, about growing old together on this piece of ground they'd claimed as their own. Then came the winter that folks would remember for generations. Snow started falling in October and didn't stop until March. Drifts piled 15 feet high against the barn. The temperature dropped so low that coffee froze in the pot before you could pour a second cup. Elias had done everything he could, rationed hay, broke ice on the water trough 3 times a day, even brought some of the animals into the barn at night to share what little warmth they could generate together. It wasn't enough. By the time spring finally broke through, 18 of his cattle were dead, 4 horses gone. The ones that survived were so thin you could count their ribs from 100 yards away. He'd sold them off for what little they'd bring, barely enough to cover the feed bills he'd run up at the general store. Half his savings went to settling accounts. The other half went to property taxes and basic supplies to get through to summer. Now, in April of 1888, Elias Ward was what mountain folks called land rich and pocket poor. He owned 40 acres of good timber and grazing land, free and clear, except for the annual tax burden. But he had exactly 53 cents to his name, a barn that needed repairs, and no livestock to justify keeping it standing. Doc Brennan had stopped by the previous week, ostensibly to check on a cut Elias had gotten splitting wood. Hiram Brennan was the closest thing Silver Creek had to a veterinarian, though he'd learned his trade through necessity rather than schooling. He was a broad man, gone soft in his 60s, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or set a broken leg with equal competence. "You're healing fine," Doc had said, rewrapping the bandage. "But that's not what's worrying me, Elias. You're getting thin. Mary Abernathy says you're not eating the meals she brings. I eat what I need. That's what concerns me." Doc had packed his supplies slowly, the way people do when they're building up to something difficult. "Town's worried about you, son. 3 years is a long time to carry grief alone up here. I'm not alone. Got the mountains, don't I? Mountains make poor conversationalists." Doc had paused at the door, his face creased with genuine concern. "There's no shame in admitting when the load's too heavy, Elias. Plenty of folks would help if you'd let them." But Elias Ward had never been good at accepting charity. His father had raised him with the understanding that a man handles his own affairs, bears his own burdens, and doesn't go begging when times turn hard. It was a hard teaching, maybe too hard, but it was in his bones now, like the ache that came before rain. Sheriff Tom Garrett visited less frequently than Doc, but with more regularity than most. Tom had grown up 3 valleys over, had worked cattle alongside Elias before taking the badge 15 years back. He was one of the few people Elias truly called friend, though weeks might pass between their conversations. "Heard you're coming to the auction Saturday," Tom had said during his last visit, sitting on Elias's porch and sharing a pipe. "That true?" "Might be. With what money, if you don't mind my asking?" Elias had pulled out his small leather pouch, poured the coins into his palm. 2 quarters and 3 pennies caught the afternoon light. "Figure I might find something worth 50 cents. Tom had studied him with those careful lawman's eyes that missed very little. "Elias, that auction's mostly for folks clearing out estates and ranches, upgrading their stock. Ain't nothing they're going for 50 cents, except maybe chickens too old to lay. Then maybe I'll come home with chickens." They'd sat in silence after that, smoke curling up into the pine boughs. 2 men who understood that sometimes a man needed to do something, anything, even if it made no practical sense. The weight of idleness could crush you worse than hard labor ever would. Mary Abernathy was the 3rd member of what Elias privately thought of as his unwanted but appreciated support. She was a widow herself, her husband lost to a logging accident 7 years prior. She lived in a small house on the edge of town, took in sewing and washing, and somehow always had extra food that needed eating before it spoiled. At least twice a week she'd make the climb up to Elias's cabin with a basket covered in checkered cloth. "Just happened to make too much stew again," she'd say, as if this was a common affliction among women cooking for one. "Hate to see it go to waste." Elias would accept the basket, thank her properly, and return it the next day, cleaned and often containing something from his own stores. Wild mushrooms he'd gathered, or trout from the creek, or firewood split to her specifications. It was a dance they both understood, charity disguised as neighborly exchange, dignity preserved on both sides. The night before the auction, Elias had sat at his table with his father's pocket watch open before him. The watch was tarnished silver, the work still keeping good time despite decades of use. His father had carried it through the California gold rush, through the long journey back east when the prospecting failed, through years of hard ranching that eventually broke his body, if not his spirit. He'd given it to Elias on his deathbed, along with advice about perseverance and faith that seemed easier to speak than to live by. "Time keeps moving whether we're ready or not," his father had said, voice thin as paper. "Trick is to move with it, not against it. And remember, son, sometimes the smallest things carry the greatest value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Elias turned the watch over, reading the inscription his grandmother had put there. "For James Ward, who believes in tomorrow." His father had believed right up until the end, had worked himself to exhaustion because he believed his labor meant something, that the ranch he was building would last beyond his years. It hadn't. The bank had taken the land 6 months after his funeral, sold it to pay debts Elias hadn't known existed. Now here sat Elias with 53 cents and 40 acres, wondering if belief was enough or if it was just another word for foolishness. He closed the watch, listening to it tick in the quiet cabin. Sarah's presence felt especially strong tonight, as if she was sitting across from him the way she used to, mending clothes while he carved wood or read by lamplight. She'd always had faith in him, even when he didn't deserve it. Even when he doubted himself, she'd been certain. "What would you do?" he asked the empty room. "Would you think I'm crazy for going tomorrow with nothing but loose change and hope?" The wind outside whispered through the pines, and in that sound Elias heard something like an answer. Not words exactly, but a feeling. The same feeling he'd had the day he'd first seen Sarah across a church social, or the day he'd decided to stake his claim on this particular piece of mountain. It was the feeling of rightness, of being in the current of something larger than yourself, even if you couldn't see where the water was taking you. He put the watch in his pocket, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow he would walk into Silver Creek with 2 quarters in his hand and see what sort of miracle 50 cents could buy. If folks wanted to laugh, let them laugh. He'd been laughed at before and survived it. At least he'd be doing something, taking action instead of sitting up here waiting for the world to forget he existed. As sleep took him, Elias dreamed of Sarah in their garden, her hands in the soil, planting seeds. When he asked what she was growing, she smiled and said, "Hope, my love. I'm planting hope. It takes a while to come up, but it's always worth the wait." He woke before dawn, with that dream still warm in his chest. Dressed in his cleanest work shirt, tucked his father's watch into his vest pocket, and began the long walk down the mountain. Toward Silver Creek and whatever waited for him there, the morning sun was already warm on Elias's shoulders. By the time he reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the walk down from his cabin took near 2 hours, following a trail that switched back and forth through timber and meadow until it finally met the main road. His boots were dusty, his shirt darkening with sweat beneath his vest. But the physical exertion felt good, purposeful in a way that sitting alone in his cabin never did. Silver Creek on a Saturday morning was alive with commerce and conversation. Wagons lined the main street, horses tied to every available post. The auction was being held in the largest livestock pen behind Garrison's Feed and Supply, and folks had come from 3 counties over to see what was on offer. Elias could hear the auctioneer's voice carrying over the crowd even before he reached the pen, that distinctive rapid-fire patter designed to separate men from their money as efficiently as possible. He found a spot along the fence where he could see without being too conspicuous. The pen was divided into sections, cattle in one area, horses in another, smaller livestock and equipment scattered around the periphery. The crowd was thick with ranchers, most of them men Elias recognized by sight, if not by name. They stood in clusters, discussing bloodlines and prices, evaluating horseflesh with the critical eyes of those whose livelihoods depended on making smart purchases. That's when Elias first noticed Clayton Mercer. Mercer was hard to miss. He stood a full head taller than most men, with shoulders that strained the seams of his expensive coat. His hat was black, felt with a silver band, his boots polished to a shine that seemed almost offensive in a working livestock pen. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, the Double M, 15,000 acres of prime grazing land that his father had acquired through a combination of shrewd dealing and ruthless intimidation. Clayton had inherited both the land and the disposition. 2 younger men flanked him, clearly his sons by the resemblance. They shared their father's height and the same set to their jaws, that look of men accustomed to having their way. One of them was pointing at a bay stallion in the horse pen, saying something that made Clayton laugh, a sound like rocks grinding together. "That's quality stock," someone near Elias muttered. "Mercer always gets the best." The auction moved efficiently through the lots. A breeding bull went for $200. A matched pair of draft horses brought $150. Elias watched the money change hands, watched men nod and shake on deals that represented more cash than he'd seen in years. His 2 quarters felt very small in his pocket. "Next up," the auctioneer called, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "We got something a bit different here, folks." This here filly came off the Benson estate settlement. Now, I'll be honest with you, she's seen better days. But she's young, maybe 2 years old. And if someone's got the time and patience, well, you never know. 2 handlers led a horse into the viewing area, and a ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. It wasn't quite laughter, not yet, but something close, the sound people make when confronted with something so pitiful it almost becomes absurd. The foal, because she was barely more than that, was the sorriest creature Elias had ever seen. She couldn't have weighed more than 300 pounds, her ribs visible through her dull coat, like barrel staves. Her legs seemed too long for her body, trembling with the effort of standing. Sores marked her withers and flanks, where the halter had rubbed and infection had set in. Her eyes were dull, sunken deep in her skull, and her breathing came in shallow, laboured pulls. "Now, I know what you're thinking," the auctioneer continued, his tone shifting to something between apology and dark humour. "But Mr. Benson's will specified that all livestock had to be auctioned, and technically this animal is still breathing, so here we are." That got the laughter he'd been fishing for. Men elbowed each other, shaking their heads. Someone near Elias said, "Kindest thing would be a bullet." "She won't last the week," another voice agreed. Clayton Mercer's voice carried over the crowd, loud and full of contempt. "Might as well save everyone time and render her down for glue now." More laughter. The foal flinched at the noise, her ears flattening against her skull. The handlers held her steady, looking embarrassed to be associated with such a specimen. "Well then," the auctioneer said, "let's not waste daylight. Do I hear $50? 25. Come on now, somebody must need a project horse." Silence. Men looked at their boots, or suddenly found something fascinating in the distance. The auctioneer's face reddened slightly. $10. 5, nothing. The foal swayed on her feet, and for a moment Elias thought she might collapse right there in the pen. One of the handlers tightened his grip on the lead rope, keeping her upright through sheer force. "All right then," the auctioneer said, his voice taking on a tone of finality mixed with theatrical desperation. "I'll tell you what, folks. 50 cents. 50 cents to anyone fool enough to feed her. At least that way I can tell the estate lawyer I sold every animal like the will specified." The laughter was louder now, men genuinely amused by the absurdity of the situation. 50 cents for a dying horse. It was the kind of joke that would be retold in saloons for weeks to come. Elias felt something shift in his chest. He was looking at the foal, really looking, and seeing past the protruding ribs and the dull coat and the sores that marked her suffering. He was seeing the way she held her head, despite everything, with a kind of dignity. The way her eyes, though dimmed by hunger and neglect, still held a spark of awareness, of presence. She was scared, certainly, and sick beyond what most animals could survive. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. He thought of Sarah in their garden, her hands gentle on seedlings that had nearly frozen in a late frost. "Life wants to live," she told him. "Sometimes it just needs a little help remembering how." He thought of his father's watch in his pocket, the inscription about believing in tomorrow. He thought of the dream he'd had, Sarah planting hope in the soil. His hand moved to his pocket, fingers closing around the 2 quarters there. They were warm from being carried against his body. They were the last money he had in the world. They represented the absolute bottom of his resources, the final measure of how far he'd fallen from the man who'd once run a successful operation. They were also the price of trying, of refusing to let something die when maybe, just maybe, it could be saved. Elias pushed away from the fence and raised his hand. The crowd's noise died down as people noticed his movement. Heads turned. Someone whispered his name and others picked it up, the words spreading through the pen like a wind through grass. "That's Elias Ward, the mountain man. Lost everything last winter." The auctioneer, clearly relieved to have any bid at all, seized the moment. "We have 50 cents. Gentleman right there, Elias Ward. Do I hear more? Anyone want to go 75 cents? Clayton Mercer's voice cut through the silence like an axe through kindling. "Let him have it, Frank. That nag won't live through the week, and Ward there needs all the dead animals he can get. Maybe he can learn from them how to give up gracefully. The crowd erupted in laughter, louder and crueler than before. Elias felt the weight of their amusement, their pity and scorn mixed together. He saw men looking at him with expressions that ranged from sympathy to contempt. He was the entertainment now, the fool who'd spent his last 50 cents on a dying horse, the broken man making a spectacle of himself. Sheriff Tom Garrett was working his way through the crowd toward him, concern clear on his face. Doc Brennan stood near the back, looking like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. Elias ignored them all. He stepped forward, pulled out his 2 quarters, and placed them in the auctioneer's outstretched hand. The coins clinked together, a tiny sound that seemed loud in the sudden quiet. "Sold to Elias Ward for 50 cents, the auctioneer said. His voice subdued now, the showmanship drained out of it. "Sir, you can collect your purchase from the handlers." Elias approached the foal slowly, the way you'd approach anything hurt and scared. The handlers looked relieved to be rid of their charge, practically shoving the lead rope into his hands before hurrying off to prepare the next lot. Up close, the foal was even worse than she'd appeared from the fence. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her coat rough with embedded dirt and dried sweat. The sores on her withers were oozing, and flies had gathered around them despite the handler's attempts to keep them away. She smelled of sickness and neglect, of an animal who'd been failed by every human who'd encountered her. Elias reached out slowly, let his hand hover near her muzzle so she could catch his scent. After a moment, she shifted her head slightly toward him, nostrils flaring. The lead rope hung loose in his other hand. She could have pulled away if she'd wanted. She didn't. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. I promise you that." Behind him, he heard Clayton Mercer's voice, still loud enough to carry. "This ought to be good. Give it 3 days before Ward's digging a hole on that mountain of his." One of Mercer's sons, the younger one, laughed, but it sounded forced. Elias saw the boy watching the foal, with something that might have been sympathy quickly hidden behind a mask of family loyalty. Tom Garrett reached Elias's side, his voice quiet but urgent. "Elias, you don't have to do this. We can find someone to put her down humanely." "No shame in that. No shame in trying either," Elias replied. "She's past saving. Look at her, man." "I'm looking. I see the same thing I saw in the mirror this morning. Something that's had a hard time of it but isn't ready to quit yet." Tom started to respond, then stopped, recognizing the set of Elias's jaw. Instead, he sighed and said, "You want help getting her up the mountain?" "I can manage." "With what?" "She can barely walk." "Then I'll carry her if I have to," and he would. Elias knew that with absolute certainty. He'd made a promise, spent his last money on a life that everyone else had written off as worthless. He'd walk her as far as she could go, and if she collapsed, he'd figure out the rest from there. That was what you did when you made a commitment. You saw it through, regardless of the odds or what anyone else thought. He fashioned a makeshift halter from old leather scraps someone had left hanging on the fence, replacing the rough rope that had caused some of her sores. His hands worked automatically, tying knots his father had taught him 40 years ago, knots that would hold without chafing. The foal stood still for it, as if she understood he was trying to help. "All right," Elias said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Let's go home." The walk back up the mountain was the longest 2 hours of Elias's life. The foal made it maybe a quarter mile before her legs began to buckle. He coaxed her forward another 100 yards, then another, until finally she simply couldn't take another step. She stood with her head hanging almost to the ground, sides heaving, completely spent. Elias looked up the mountain trail ahead, calculating distance and difficulty. Then he looked at the foal, at this creature who'd been failed and abandoned and left to die, and who'd still found the strength to try as long as she could. "Fair enough," he said. "We'll rest here a bit." They sat together by the side of the trail, Elias on a fallen log and the foal lying in the grass beside him. He talked to her in that low, steady voice, the same way he used to talk to Sarah when she couldn't sleep at night. He told her about the cabin, about the barn where she'd have clean straw and fresh water. He told her about the meadow where wildflowers grew in summer. He told her that she had a future, even if she couldn't see it yet, After an hour, as the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, the foal struggled to her feet. They made another quarter-mile before she had to rest again. This time Elias gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing despite her size, and carried her. His back screamed in protest. His legs burned. Sweat ran into his eyes. He walked until his arms went numb, then laid her down gently and rested until feeling returned. Then picked her up and walked some more. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was starting its descent toward evening. Elias's shirt was soaked through with sweat. His arms and back felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. The foal was unconscious in his arms, though he could feel her heart still beating against his chest. Rapid and weak but persistent, he carried her into the barn, laid her on fresh straw he'd laid out that morning in what now seemed like a lifetime ago. He covered her with an old blanket, made sure she was comfortable, and then went to the pump to bring water and mix the first of what would be many careful meals designed to coax a starving body back from the edge. As darkness fell over the mountain and the first stars appeared overhead, Elias sat beside the foal in the lamplight, watching her breathe. She'd made it this far. They both had. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own impossibilities to overcome. But tonight, in this barn, with straw rustling and the smell of pine drifting through the open door, Elias Ward and a 50-cent foal were both still alive. And sometimes, he thought, remembering Sarah's smile in his dream, that was miracle enough to start with. The foal didn't die that first night, though Elias checked her breathing so many times he lost count. Each time he pressed his hand to her side to feel the rise and fall of her ribs. Each time he held his own breath until he felt hers continue. He was both relieved and terrified. Relief that she'd made it another hour. Terror at what the next hour might bring. He'd set up camp in the barn, unwilling to leave her alone even for the short walk to his cabin. An old quilt served as his bedding, spread on the straw near enough to the foal's stall that he could reach out and touch her without rising. The lantern burned low on a hook overhead, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. Outside, the mountain night settled in with its familiar sounds, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creek running over stones in its endless journey down to the valley. Around midnight, Elias went to his cabin and retrieved Sarah's recipe book. It was a leather-bound journal, worn soft with use, pages filled with her neat handwriting. She'd started it the first year of their marriage, collecting remedies and treatments she'd learned from her mother and grandmother, adding her own observations and discoveries over time. There were recipes for poultices and tonics, instructions for treating everything from colic to cough, detailed notes on nutrition for animals too sick to eat on their own. By lamplight, Elias paged through the familiar entries until he found what he was looking for. For starving animals, Sarah had written at the top of the page. The stomach has forgotten how to work. Must teach it again, slowly, like teaching a child to walk. Too much food too fast will kill, as surely as no food at all. The instructions were precise. Warm water with a little molasses and salt, given in small amounts every 2 hours. Then thin gruel made from oats boiled until they nearly dissolved. Then gradually thicker mixtures, more substance, more nourishment, always watching for signs of distress, always ready to step back if the body showed it wasn't ready to accept more. Elias mixed the first batch in a wooden bucket, warming it carefully over a small fire he'd built in the barn's stone pit. The foal was awake but listless, her eyes following his movements without much interest. When he brought the bucket to her stall, she didn't lift her head. "Come on now," he said softly, dipping his fingers in the mixture and holding them near her muzzle. "Just a taste. That's all I'm asking." She turned her head away. He tried again, patient, persistent. On the 5th attempt, her nostrils flared and she licked his fingers tentatively. The taste seemed to surprise her, and after a moment she licked again with more interest. Progress. Small but real. Over the next hours he got perhaps a cup of liquid into her, a tablespoon at a time. It was exhausting work, requiring constant attention and patience, but Elias found himself falling into the rhythm of it. Mix the formula. Wait for it to cool to the right temperature. Offer it slowly. Clean her sores with boiled water and cloth. Cover her again with the blanket. Wait. Begin again. Dawn came with grey light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls. Elias heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Doc Brennan standing in the doorway, medical bag in hand. "Mary told me you'd bought a horse at the auction," Doc said, stepping into the barn. "Heard it was in rough shape. Thought I'd come see if I could help." Elias gestured toward the stall. Doc approached, set down his bag, and spent several long minutes examining the foal. His face remained professionally neutral, but Elias could read the conclusions forming behind his eyes. When Doc finally straightened and turned to face him, his expression was a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "Elias, I know what you're trying to do here, and I respect the impulse. But son, this animal is too far gone. She's got infections, malnutrition so severe her organs are probably failing, and she's exhausted beyond what rest can fix. The kindest thing you could do is let me put her down peaceful. I'll do it for free, and I'll help you bury her proper." "No, be reasonable, man. She's suffering. She's fighting," Elias corrected. "There's a difference. I've seen dying, Doc. I held my wife while she died. I know what it looks like when someone gives up." "This horse hasn't given up," Doc sighed, the sound of a man who'd had this argument before and knew how it would end. "All right, but when the time comes, and it will come, you send for me. Don't let her suffer needlessly just because you can't admit defeat. Promise me that, I promise. If she's truly suffering with no hope, I'll call you. But until then, I'm doing this." Doc picked up his bag, paused at the door. "Sarah's recipe book," he said, nodding toward the open journal on the straw beside Elias. "That's what you're using?" "Yes. She knew her way around sick animals, your Sarah. Saved a colt of mine once, when I'd about given up hope. She had a gift." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "You staying out here with her? Until she doesn't need me anymore. Then I'll tell Mary to bring food for two. You and the horse both need feeding." Doc touched the brim of his hat. "Good luck, Elias. You're going to need it." After Doc left, Elias continued his routine. Feed, clean, rest, repeat. The sun climbed higher, warming the barn until he had to crack the doors wider for airflow. The foal's eyes seemed a little brighter by mid-morning, or maybe he was just wishing they were. She drank more readily now, though still in tiny amounts. Her breathing remained labored but steady. Around noon, Mary Abernathy arrived with a basket containing bread, cheese, and a jar of soup still warm from her stove. She also brought clean cloths, a bottle of what she called her special liniment, and a concerned look that reminded Elias of how Sarah used to look when he was being particularly stubborn about something. "Doc says she probably won't make it," Mary said not unkindly, as she helped Elias apply the liniment to the foal's sores. The mixture smelled of herbs and pine tar, and the foal flinched, but didn't fight the treatment. "Doc says a lot of things. He's usually right, usually isn't always." Mary smiled at that, a small expression that carried understanding. "No, it isn't. My Harold, God rest him, he always said the difference between giving up and pushing through was just choosing to take one more step, even when you couldn't see where that step would lead. Sounds like Harold was a wise man. He was a stubborn fool most of the time," Mary said, but her voice was gentle with memory. "But sometimes stubborn is what's needed. Just promise me you'll eat that soup while it's warm. Can't help this horse if you collapse from hunger." She stayed for an hour, helping with the work, her presence a quiet comfort that required no conversation beyond what was necessary. When she left, she promised to return tomorrow with more supplies. Elias thanked her, knowing the thanks were inadequate, but also knowing that Mary understood anyway. The afternoon passed in more of the same careful routine. The foal managed to lift her head on her own for the first time, a small victory that felt enormous. She drank more of the formula without as much coaxing. Her eyes tracked Elias as he moved around the barn, showing the first signs of real awareness rather than just dull survival instinct. By evening, when Elias sat beside her with Sarah's journal open on his lap, reading the next set of instructions by lamplight, the foal shifted her body slightly toward him. It was the tiniest of movements, barely noticeable, but it was deliberate. She'd chosen to move closer to the human who'd stayed with her through this impossible day. Elias reached out and rested his hand on her neck, feeling warmth beneath the rough coat, feeling the pulse of blood through veins, feeling life persistent despite every reason it shouldn't be. "You need a name," he said quietly. "Can't keep calling you the Foal if you're going to stick around." He thought of Sarah, of her middle name that she'd always loved because her grandmother had carried it, Grace. It meant elegance and beauty, but it also meant unmerited favor, blessing given freely without being earned. It meant mercy when judgment was expected. It meant hope against reason. "Grace," he said, trying it out. "How's that sound to you?" The Foal, Grace, exhaled slowly, a sound that wasn't quite a sigh, but close enough. Her eyes closed, and for the first time since he'd carried her up the mountain, her breathing deepened into something that resembled actual sleep rather than exhausted collapse. Elias pulled the blanket higher over her withers, made sure the lantern was secure on its hook, and settled back against the barn wall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow, he'd have to start the long process of building her strength, of teaching her body to accept real food again, of treating the infections that still threatened her life. Tomorrow, there would be 100 things that could go wrong. But tonight, in this barn on this mountain, Grace was sleeping peacefully, and Elias Ward was keeping watch. He opened Sarah's journal again, reading ahead to the next stages of treatment, committing the instructions to memory. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the mountain breathed its pine-scented air into the barn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Life wanted to live. Sarah had been right about that. Sometimes it just needed a little help remembering how. And sometimes, Elias thought as his own eyes grew heavy with exhaustion, sometimes a man needed the same reminder that it was possible to start again. That 50 cents and faith might be enough seed money for a miracle. He fell asleep with his hand resting on Grace's neck, feeling her heartbeat steady and strong beneath his palm, and dreamed of tomorrow. 2 months passed like water over stones, each day wearing away at the impossibility of Grace's survival until what remained was simply the fact of her existence. She lived. More than that, she thrived in ways that made even Doc Brennan shake his head in wonder when he stopped by to check on her progress. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The sores on her withers healed, leaving only faint scars beneath new coat growth. Her ribs, once visible as sharp ridges, disappeared beneath developing muscle. Her eyes, which had been dull as old pennies, now gleamed with intelligence and curiosity. She'd grown too, filling out into the frame her breeding had promised before starvation had tried to erase it. Elias spent his days working with her in the small paddock he'd repaired behind the barn. He taught her to lead properly, to stand for grooming, to trust human hands on her body without flinching. Each lesson was built on patience and consistency, the same principles his father had taught him about working with horses decades ago. Grace proved an eager student, responding to gentle guidance with a willingness that suggested she understood, somehow, that she'd been given a second chance. During these morning training sessions, Elias braided a special lead rope from 3 different colored threads he'd found in Sarah's sewing basket. Blue for the past, all they'd both lost. Brown for the present, the earth they stood on, the solid reality of each day survived. And green for the future, for growth, for possibility, for the life neither of them had expected to still be living. The braiding took him 3 evenings by lamplight, his fingers remembering the patterns from making ropes in his youth. When it was finished, the rope was strong and supple, each color visible in its weaving, a physical representation of time held in his hands. He attached it to Grace's halter on a morning when frost still silvered the grass, and from that day forward it was the only lead he used with her. But Grace's improvement came against a backdrop of mounting pressure. In late June, a man arrived from the Silver Creek bank, wearing a suit that looked out of place in the mountain country. He carried a leather satchel and an apologetic expression that did nothing to soften his message. "Mr. Ward," he'd said, standing awkwardly in Elias's cabin doorway, "I'm here about the property taxes. They were due in March, and we've given extension until now, but the bank needs payment." The amount, is $147. Elias had known this was coming, but hearing the number spoken aloud made it real in a way that worrying about it hadn't. $147. It might as well have been 1,000 for all the chance he had of producing it. How long do I have? End of December. After that, the county will auction the property for back taxes. The banker had shifted his weight, uncomfortable with his role as bearer of bad news. I'm sorry, Mr. Ward. I know times have been hard. If there's anything the bank can do to help you find work, earn the money somehow, I'll find a way, Elias had said, though he had no idea what that way might be. Thank you for the extension. After the banker left, Elias sat at his table with a piece of paper and a pencil stub, doing mathematics that didn't want to add up. He could take on odd jobs in town, but carpentry and hauling paid maybe 50 cents a day when work was available. Even if he worked every single day until December, which wasn't possible, he'd fall short. He could sell his land, but then where would he go? This mountain, this cabin, they were all he had left of the life he'd built with Sarah. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd saved Grace's life, but he might lose everything in the process. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sheriff Tom Garrett brought news of another sort when he visited in July. Been hearing things in town, Tom said, sitting on Elias's porch and sharing coffee. Folks talking about that horse of yours, how she's looking healthy, how you've done the impossible bringing her back from death's door. She did the work. I just helped. Don't sell yourself short. But here's the thing, Elias. I think you might have an opportunity here. County fairs in August. They run races, nothing big, but there's prize money. First place gets $50. $50. It wasn't enough to save his land, but it was a start. Elias looked out toward the paddock where Grace was grazing, her coat shining in the summer sun. He'd noticed her speed during their training sessions, the way she could go from standing still to full gallop in what seemed like a single heartbeat. She moved with a fluid power that suggested breeding far better than her appearance at the auction had indicated. I'll think on it, Elias said, but the decision was already forming. He needed money. Grace was fast. The math was simple, even if everything else about the situation was complicated. That afternoon, he began training in earnest. Not just leading and grooming, but running. He'd take Grace to the high meadow where the ground was level and let her stretch out, feeling the power in her stride, the joy she took in movement. She ran like she'd been born to it, like something wild that had temporarily agreed to tolerate human company, but never forgot what it meant to be free. Mary Abernathy noticed the change in their routine when she brought food one morning. You entering that fair race? She asked directly, in her way that had no patience for dancing around subjects, thinking about it. Good. Town could use something to cheer about. And you could use the money, I reckon. That obvious? Elias Ward, everyone in Silver Creek knows about your tax situation. Probably knew before you did. Small town doesn't keep those kinds of secrets. She set down her basket and fixed him with a look that had no judgment in it, only practicality. If that horse can run, you should let her. Pride's a luxury, and you can't afford luxuries right now. She was right, though it stung to admit it. Pride had kept him on this mountain after Sarah died, refusing offers of help, insisting he could manage alone. Pride had made him reluctant to accept Mary's food baskets or Doc's free veterinary care. Pride was expensive, and he was poor. The next morning, Elias took Grace to town for the first time since the auction. It was a risk. People would see her, would form opinions, might cause trouble, but she needed to get used to crowds, to noise, to the chaos of town if she was going to race at the fair. They walked down the mountain trail together, Grace's lead rope braided with blue, brown, and green threads, the morning sun warm on their backs. And for the first time in years, Elias Ward felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Not certainty, he'd lost his taste for certainty when Sarah died, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't finished yet. Grace tossed her head as they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek, as if she could sense his thoughts and agreed with them. They'd both been written off as lost causes. They'd both survived anyway. Now it was time to see what came next. Whatever that turned out to be, they'd face it together. The reaction to Grace in Silver Creek was mixed, ranging from genuine surprise to skeptical dismissal. People stopped on the street to watch as Elias led her through town, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like wonder. This was the same dying foal from the auction, transformed into a sleek, powerful mare who moved with natural grace and barely contained energy. "I'll be damned," someone muttered. "That's Ward's 50-cent horse? Can't be the same animal." "It is, though. Look at that star on her forehead. Same pattern." The conversations followed them like ripples behind a boat. Elias kept his eyes forward, his hand steady on Grace's lead rope, giving her confidence through his own calm presence. She handled the attention well, though her ears swiveled constantly, tracking every sound and movement. Clayton Mercer was standing outside the feed store when they passed. Elias saw him stiffen, saw the calculation move across his features as he reassessed what he was seeing. The dying joke of a horse had become something worth noticing, and Mercer wasn't a man who liked being proven wrong about anything. "Ward," Mercer called out, his voice carrying that edge of challenge it always held. "That the nag from Benson's auction?" "It is. You planning on entering her in the fair race?" "I am." Mercer studied Grace with the eye of a man who'd been around horses his entire life. Whatever he saw made his jaw tighten slightly. "Well, it's your entry fee to waste. Ironclad's won that race 3 years running. He'll win it again this year." Ironclad was Mercer's prize stallion, a massive black horse with the build of a war machine and the temperament to match. Elias had seen him race before, pure power and intimidation, running not just to win but to dominate. He was everything Grace wasn't, expensive, perfectly trained from birth, the product of careful breeding and unlimited resources. "May the best horse win," Elias said evenly. "Oh, he will," Mercer replied. "Count on that." After Mercer walked away, a young boy detached himself from the shadows beside the feed store. He couldn't have been more than 13, with Mercer's height already showing in his lanky frame, but without his father's hardness in his features. This was Timothy, Clayton's youngest son, and the look on his face was pure longing as he stared at Grace. "Mr. Ward." Timothy's voice cracked slightly on the words, still changing from boy to man. Would you mind if I petted her?" Elias hesitated. Getting involved with a Mercer, even a young one, was asking for complications. But something in Timothy's expression reminded him of himself at that age, hungry for connection with horses, seeing in them something pure that human company rarely offered. "Slow and gentle," Elias said. "Let her smell your hand first." Timothy approached with the careful reverence of someone who understood he was in the presence of something special. He held out his hand, let Grace investigate, then slowly stroked her neck when she allowed it. His face lit up with uncomplicated joy. "She's beautiful," Timothy breathed. "I was there at the auction when Father laughed at you for buying her. I thought she'd die too. Everyone did. But you saved her." "We saved each other," Elias corrected quietly. "Could I—" Timothy stopped, looked over his shoulder toward where his father had disappeared into the general store. "Could I come visit her sometime? Help with training? I know Father wouldn't like it, but I'm good with horses, I promise. I wouldn't get in the way." Elias saw the hunger there, the need for something his father's ranch, with all its resources, apparently wasn't providing. He should say no. Getting between a father and son, especially when the father was Clayton Mercer, was asking for trouble he couldn't afford. But he remembered being young and searching for meaning, for connection, for someone to teach him things that mattered. "You'd have to come early morning," Elias said, "before your father might notice. And you'd have to work, not just watch. I need help with training if we're going to be ready for the fair." Timothy's face blazed with gratitude. "I'll be there." "Tomorrow morning, before sunrise?" "That'll work." After Timothy ran off, likely to finish whatever errand had brought him to town, Elias led Grace to the livery stable, where he'd arranged to keep her for a few hours while he did some paying work. He'd found carpentry jobs, small repairs that needed skilled hands, enough to earn a few dollars toward his growing tax debt. The liveryman, An old-timer named Josiah, who'd worked with horses for 50 years, took Grace's lead rope and studied her with professional interest. "This that auction horse everyone's talking about?" "Yes, heard you brought her back from death. Heard she might be fast." Josiah ran his hands over Grace's legs, checking conformation and soundness. "Good bone structure. Deep chest. She's built for running, that's certain." "Where'd she come from originally? Benson never said much about her lineage?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "She was just part of his estate sale." "Shame. Horse like this, you'd like to know her bloodline." Josiah straightened, patting Grace's shoulder. "Well, whatever she is, you've done right by her. I'll keep her comfortable while you work. And Elias, don't let Mercer intimidate you about that race. I've seen Ironclad run. He's powerful, no question. But power isn't the same as heart. Sometimes heart wins out." Elias spent the afternoon doing repairs on a merchant storage building, earning $2 for work that left his hands raw and his back aching. It was honest labor, but it was also painfully clear that he'd never earn enough this way to save his land. Even working every day until December wouldn't generate the money he needed. The fair race was his best chance. Maybe his only chance, but $50 would only buy him time, not salvation. That evening, he discovered something that changed everything. He'd been going through his father's old trunk in the barn, looking for some spare rope, when he found a wooden box he'd somehow never noticed before. Inside was a set of racing silks, faded blue and silver, the colors dulled by age, but still beautiful in their simplicity. He lifted them out carefully, the fabric soft with years. Underneath was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1856, showing his father standing beside a lean gray mare, both of them posed in victory. The headline read, "James Ward takes Silver Creek Derby with Mountain Wind." Elias stared at the clipping, a whole hidden history suddenly revealed. His father had raced horses, had won races, had worn these colors in victory before life, and circumstances had turned him toward ranching and away from the track. He'd never spoken of it, never mentioned this part of his past. Why? Elias sat in the barn as twilight deepened outside, holding the silks in his hands, thinking about the secrets people keep and the dreams they bury when practicality demands it. His father had been a horseman, truly a horseman, before becoming the worn-down rancher Elias had known. He'd had glory and given it up, trading racing colors for work clothes, traded the possibility of greatness for the certainty of slow failure. What would his father say if he could see Elias now standing at the same crossroads? Would he encourage the race, or would he warn against it, counsel accepting defeat with dignity rather than risking public humiliation? Elias thought about the inscription on the pocket watch, "For James Ward, who believes in tomorrow." His grandmother had seen something in her son that maybe his son had missed. A man who fundamentally believed in possibilities, who'd chosen hope even when evidence suggested otherwise. "All right, old man," Elias said to the empty barn, to his father's ghost if it was listening. "Let's see if faith runs in the family." He carefully folded the silks and took them back to his cabin. Tomorrow, Timothy would arrive for his first training session, and together they'd begin preparing Grace in earnest for the race. It wasn't much of a plan, and the odds were still heavily against them, but it was action. It was trying. It was refusing to surrender to the slow erosion of hope. Grace whinnied from her stall, the sound cutting through the quiet evening. Elias walked back to the barn, found her with her head over the stall door, watching for him. He stroked her neck, felt the solid warmth of her, the reality of this impossible animal who shouldn't have survived, but had anyway. "We're going to race," he told her. "You and me in those colors my father wore. We're going to show this town what's possible when you refuse to quit. What do you think about that?" Grace leaned into his hand, and in that simple gesture Elias felt something like agreement, like partnership. They'd made a deal at that auction, whether either of them had realized it at the time. His 50 cents for her life, her survival for his purpose. They were bound together now in a story that wasn't finished, that maybe was just beginning. The stars came out overhead, the same stars that had watched his father race. that had witnessed every hope and loss that had played out on this mountain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Elias Ward had racing silks in his cabin and a fast horse in his barn, and the beginning of a plan that might just save them both. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Timothy arrived the next morning while darkness still held the mountain, his footsteps quiet on the trail leading to Elias's cabin. True to his word, the boy had come ready to work, dressed in clothes that could handle dirt and labor. His face was eager in the lamplight as Elias met him at the barn door. "My father thinks I'm checking fence lines on the North Range," Timothy said, the lie sitting awkwardly on his young features. "I've got maybe 2 hours before I need to be back. Then let's not waste them." They worked together in the cool pre-dawn, Elias teaching Timothy the basics of training a racehorse, while Grace watched with patient intelligence. The boy had good instincts and gentle hands, moving around the horse with natural confidence that suggested he'd inherited his father's gift with animals, if not his temperament. "Why does father hate you?" Timothy asked during a break, the question coming out blunt and unfiltered in the way of young people who haven't learned to soften their curiosity yet. Elias considered the question while checking Grace's hooves for stones. "I don't think he hates me specifically. I think I represent something he doesn't understand. Someone who chose a different path, who doesn't compete with him or want what he has. But you bought Grace. You're racing against Ironclad. I bought a dying horse nobody else wanted. And I'm racing to save my land, not to prove anything to your father." Elias set down Grace's hoof and straightened. "Sometimes, Timothy, people see competition where there isn't any. They see the world as something to be won or lost, and they can't understand that some folks are just trying to survive." Timothy absorbed this quietly, then said, "He's planning something. I heard him talking to my brothers last night. About the race. About making sure Ironclad wins. Making sure how? I don't know exactly. But father doesn't like uncertainty. He didn't like how Grace looked in town yesterday, how people were talking. I think he wants to ensure there's no upset." The words hung between them, carrying implications that made Elias's jaw tighten. But before he could respond, Timothy continued in a rush. "I'm telling you this because it's wrong. Whatever he's planning, it's wrong. Grace deserves a fair race. You deserve a fair race. I know he's my father, but that doesn't mean I have to agree with everything he does." There was courage in that admission, the kind that cost something real. Elias put a hand on Timothy's shoulder, felt the boy trying not to shake with the weight of his divided loyalty. "Thank you for telling me. That took backbone. I just wanted to be honest," Timothy said quietly. "I want to see which horse is really faster." "Is that wrong?" "That's exactly right. That's about as right as anything gets." They trained for another hour as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Grace responded beautifully to the work, her speed becoming more controlled, her starts more explosive. She loved the running, that much was clear. It wasn't just exercise for her. It was joy made physical, freedom expressed in the drumming of hooves on packed earth. A week passed, then another. Timothy came every morning he could manage, helping with the training, learning more about horses than his father's vast operation had ever taught him. Elias found himself enjoying the boy's company, found himself becoming something like a teacher, passing on knowledge the way his father had passed it to him, the way Sarah had passed on her healing wisdom through that leather-bound journal. The morning the challenge letter arrived, Elias knew immediately what it was. The envelope was expensive paper, sealed with red wax, stamped with the double M brand. Inside, in formal script that had probably been written by a hired clerk, was Clayton Mercer's proposal. The letter laid out terms for a winner-take-all race, separate from the county fair event. $500 winner's purse. The loser would forfeit something of equivalent value. In Mercer's case, he'd put up the money directly. In Elias's case, given his lack of cash, the letter suggested his property deed would serve as collateral. Elias read it twice, his hand steady, but his mind racing through implications. $500 was more than enough to save his land. It would pay the taxes and leave money for repairs, for rebuilding his herd, for starting over with some security. But if he lost, he'd lose everything. The cabin, the land, the place where Sarah was buried. Every physical connection to the life they'd built together would be gone. The letter was Clayton Mercer's way of forcing the issue, of making the situation binary. Win everything or lose everything. No middle ground, no room for dignified retreat. Sheriff Tom Garrett arrived that afternoon, having heard about the challenge somehow. Small towns and their efficient gossip networks made secrets nearly impossible. "Don't do it," Tom said flatly, standing in Elias's cabin with the letter in his hands. "This is exactly what Mercer wants. He's setting you up, Elias, even if Grace is fast. He'll find a way to make sure she doesn't win." Timothy said the same thing. Young Mercer's got a good head on his shoulders, better than his father deserves. You should listen to him. Elias looked out his window toward the barn, where Grace was visible in the paddock, her coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. "What choice do I have, Tom? I need $500 by December, or I lose the land anyway. Even winning the fair race only gives me $50. The bank isn't going to wait, and I can't earn that kind of money any other way. There has to be another option. Tell me what it is, and I'll take it." Tom had no answer to that, because there wasn't one. They both knew it. Elias was trapped in a corner, and Mercer had been smart enough to see it and exploit it. The challenge letter wasn't just about racing. It was about forcing Elias to gamble everything on a single moment, knowing that desperation would make him agree to terms he'd never accept otherwise. "If you're going to do this," Tom said finally, "then do it smart. Get everything in writing. Make sure there are witnesses. And for God's sake, keep that horse close. Don't give Mercer any opportunity for sabotage. I'll be careful. Careful might not be enough. You're dealing with a man who doesn't know how to lose." Tom set down the letter and headed for the door, then paused. "Mary's worried about you. Doc's worried about you. Hell, half the town is worried about you. But I think I'm starting to understand why you're doing this. It's not really about the money, is it?" Elias thought about that. "It's about finishing something I started when I dropped those 2 quarters in that auctioneer's hand. Grace lived because I chose to believe she could. Now I have to see that belief through to the end, whatever that end turns out to be. That's either the wisest thing I've heard or the most foolish. Can't quite tell which. Me neither." "Tom, me neither." After the sheriff left, Elias took the letter and a pen and wrote his acceptance at the bottom, signing his name in firm strokes that didn't betray the uncertainty churning in his gut. He'd have 6 weeks to prepare for a race that would decide everything. 6 weeks to turn a rescued horse into a champion. 6 weeks to either save his life or lose it entirely. He looked at Sarah's picture on the mantel, at her smile captured in fading sepia tones. "You always said I was stubborn," he told her image. "And guess I'm about to prove you right one more time." Then he saddled Grace and rode down to town to deliver his response. Timothy's words about his father's plans echoing in his mind like a warning bell that wouldn't stop ringing. 3 days before the race, a stranger arrived in Silver Creek, riding a tired bay gelding and carrying the dusty look of someone who'd traveled a long way with purpose. He was an older man, maybe 70, with silver hair and hands marked by a lifetime of working with horses. He asked around town for Elias Ward, and by evening he'd made his way up the mountain trail to the cabin where Grace stood in the paddock, her coat catching the last light of day. The stranger stood at the fence for a long time, just watching her. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, something that might have been grief, and finally a kind of wonder. When Elias approached from the barn, the old man turned to him with eyes that held unshed tears. "My name is Jacob Cross," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I bred horses in Kentucky before the war, raised a line called Silver Wind, finest racing stock in 3 states, maybe in the whole country. They were known for their speed, their heart, and a specific pattern of markings." He pointed at Grace, that star on her forehead shaped like a lightning bolt, the silver dappling on her hindquarters, the white socks on her rear legs only. "That's Silver Wind breeding, Mr. Ward. I'd stake my life on it." Elias felt something shift in his understanding of the world, like a puzzle piece clicking into place that revealed a completely different picture than what he'd been seeing. That's impossible. She was abandoned, half-starved. Nobody knew where she came from. "Let me tell you a story," Jacob said, his gaze never leaving Grace. "In 1862, my farm burned during a Confederate raid. Most of my horses died. Some were stolen, a few scattered into the countryside. I thought the bloodline was lost completely. I spent years trying to track down survivors, but the war scattered records, scattered people, scattered everything. I finally gave up and moved west, spent the last 25 years trying to forget what I'd lost." He paused, his jaw working as he fought for control over his emotions. 3 days ago, I was in a saloon in Denver. Heard a man talking about a race in Silver Creek, about a horse that had been bought for 50 cents and brought back from death. He described the markings. I didn't believe it at first, thought maybe someone had bred something similar by chance. But I had to see for myself. And now I'm looking at what might be one of the last surviving descendants of Silver Wind. It's like seeing a ghost. Mr. Ward, a beautiful, impossible ghost. Elias leaned against the fence, trying to process this revelation. Grace wasn't just a lucky find. She was legacy, bloodline, the last thread of something great that had nearly been lost to history. How did she end up abandoned in Colorado territory? That I can't tell you for certain. But I can guess. After the war, people moved west in waves. Someone might have bought or traded for one of the scattered Silver Wind horses, brought them out here, bred them. Maybe they didn't know what they had, or maybe circumstances forced them to let the bloodline degrade. Animals get lost, get sold, fall on hard times, same as people. Somehow, through all of that, the bloodline survived. He looked at Elias with renewed intensity. "That mare you're looking at isn't just fast, Mr. Ward. She's bred for greatness. It's in her bones, in her blood, in every fiber of her being. The starvation nearly killed her, but it couldn't erase what she is." Jacob pulled a leather folder from his saddlebag and opened it carefully. Inside were yellowed breeding records, newspaper clippings, and photographs that had survived decades of storage. He showed Elias pictures of horses that could have been Grace's siblings. The same distinctive markings, the same elegant conformation. He showed him racing results from before the war, wins by margins that seemed impossible. Silver Wind stock was undefeated in 37 races, Jacob said. Undefeated. People came from 5 states to race against them and went home disappointed every time. The secret was in the breeding, selecting not just for speed, but for heart, for the will to run past exhaustion, for the intelligence to pace themselves and then unleash everything in the final stretch. He closed the folder carefully. "Mr. Ward, you didn't just save a dying horse. You saved a piece of American racing history that was thought lost forever." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Grace graze peacefully, unaware that she'd just been revealed as something extraordinary. Finally, Elias said, "This explains why she survived when she shouldn't have. That heart you mentioned, exactly. A normal horse would have died from what she endured. But Silver Wind blood, they don't quit. They find a way." Jacob turned to face Elias fully. "Now I have a question for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. I came here prepared to make an offer. I'll give you $5,000 for that mare. Enough to save your land, rebuild your operation, live comfortably. I'll take her back to Kentucky, establish a new breeding program, ensure that the Silver Wind line continues. She'd want for nothing, and she'd be doing what she was bred to do, creating the next generation of champions. $5,000. The number hung in the air between them like a tangible thing. It was salvation, security, the answer to every practical problem Elias faced. He could pay his taxes, repair his cabin, buy new livestock, start over with actual resources instead of just hope and stubborn determination. All he had to do was sell Grace to a man who clearly loved her bloodline and would care for her properly. Elias looked at Grace, at the mare who'd been dying when he'd first held her lead rope, who'd survived through sheer will and his refusal to give up on her. He remembered carrying her up the mountain in his arms, remembered the sleepless nights in the barn, remembered the moment she'd first stood on her own, the first time she'd whinnied when he approached, the first time she'd run with pure joy rather than just following commands. He thought about Sarah and what she would say. He remembered her hands in the garden, planting seeds, her words about hope taking time to grow, but being worth the wait. He remembered her voice saying that love wasn't something you bought or sold, that some bonds mattered more than practical considerations. "Mr. Cross," Elias said slowly, "I respect your offer, and I understand what Grace means to you in terms of bloodline and history. But she's not for sale. Not for 5,000, not for 50,000. She's family. When I bought her at that auction, I made a promise, maybe to her, maybe to myself, maybe to my late wife's memory. I promised I'd see it through. That promise doesn't have a price tag." Jacob studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I thought you might say that. Hoped you would, actually, though it means I go home empty-handed." He extended his hand. "You're a good man, Mr. Ward. Grace is lucky to have you, and you're lucky to have her. That's a rare thing, luck working both directions at once." They shook hands, and Elias felt the calluses on Jacob's palm, the strength still there despite his age. These were horsemen's hands, hands that had built something beautiful and lost it and kept living anyway, hands that understood sacrifice and love in equal measure. "I'll be staying in Silver Creek through the race," Jacob said. "If you'll allow it, I'd like to help with the final preparations. I know things about training Silver Wind stock that might make a difference. And I'd very much like to see her run, to see what she can do when she's healthy and strong, and given a chance to show what's in her blood." "I'd be grateful for the help," Elias admitted. "I'm racing against a man who has resources I'll never have, who's probably planning ways to ensure Grace never crosses that finish line first." "Then we'd better make sure she's ready for anything." Jacob's expression hardened with determination. "Silver Wind horses were bred for more than just speed, Mr. Ward. They were bred to overcome, to find a way when there wasn't one, to run past impossible and come out the other side victorious. Grace has that in her, and now we're going to make sure she knows it too." That night, with Jacob Cross staying in his cabin's spare room, Elias sat up late, writing in his journal by lamplight. He documented everything that had happened: Jacob's arrival, the revelation about Grace's breeding, the offer he'd refused. He wrote about the weight of knowing that Grace was special, that the stakes of the upcoming race had somehow gotten even higher. But he also wrote about the certainty he'd felt when refusing the money. It was the same certainty he'd felt at the auction when everyone was laughing, the same certainty that had kept him feeding Grace through those early desperate weeks when death seemed more likely than survival. It was the certainty that some things mattered more than money, more than security, more than practical considerations that could be calculated on paper. Grace was family. That was the truth of it, simple and complete. You didn't sell family, no matter how much money was offered. You didn't abandon them when things got hard. You stood beside them and faced whatever came next, together. Elias closed the journal and extinguished the lamp. Through his window, he could see the barn silhouetted against the starlit sky. Grace was in there, sleeping peacefully, unaware that she carried the blood of champions, that she represented history thought lost forever. Tomorrow, they'd begin the final phase of training with Jacob's guidance, preparing for a race that would determine everything. But tonight, Elias Ward slept soundly, knowing he'd made the right choice. Some decisions weren't about practical outcomes. They were about honor, about keeping promises, about choosing love over security. Sarah would have understood. His father would have understood. And somewhere in the great unknowable beyond, Elias hoped they were both proud of the stubborn fool who'd bought a dying horse for 50 cents, and then refused $5,000 for her because some things, some rare and precious things, simply weren't for sale. The wind whispered through the pines outside, and in its voice Elias heard approval, or maybe just the mountain breathing its ancient wisdom into the night. Either way, it was enough. The final 2 days before the race passed in a blur of focused preparation that felt both too fast and too slow at once. Jacob Cross proved invaluable. his knowledge of Silver Wind bloodline training techniques adding layers of strategy to Elias's simpler approach. They worked Grace through specialized drills designed to maximize her natural gifts, explosive starts, strategic pacing, reading terrain advantages, and most importantly, tapping into that legendary reserve of stamina that Silver Wind horses were famous for. The trick, Jacob explained during one training session, is teaching her to hold back 70% in the first 3/4 of any race. Most horses burn themselves out trying to lead from the beginning. Silver Wind stock is different. They win in the final stretch when everyone else is exhausted. You need to trust her, and she needs to trust you to know when to let her loose. Elias absorbed every word, every technique, storing it away like precious supplies before a long winter. His journal entries during these days were detailed, methodical, documenting not just the training regimen, but also his own thoughts. His fears and hopes intertwined on the page in handwriting that grew smaller and tighter as the race approached. "Tomorrow, everything changes," he wrote the night before. "Win or lose, nothing will be the same after tomorrow. I find myself thinking of Sarah constantly, wondering if she'd be proud of this choice or disappointed that I've risked everything on a single race. But I remember her hands planting seeds in ground that looked too barren to support life, and I remember her smile when those seeds grew anyway. She believed in impossible things. Maybe I'm just following her example." Timothy continued coming for the dawn training sessions, though his face carried more worry with each visit. On the final morning before the race, he pulled Elias aside, while Jacob worked with Grace on her cool-down routine. "They're planning something for tomorrow," Timothy said, his voice urgent and low. "I heard Father and my brothers talking last night. They mentioned the transport to the race grounds. Something about spooking Grace before the race even starts. Father's hired men, hands from the ranch who'll do anything he asks. They're going to intercept you on the road." Elias felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice calm. What time were they planning this? "Mid-morning, when most folks would be heading to the fairgrounds. They figure you'll take the main road, that Grace will be nervous in the crowd. They're going to create a disturbance, something to rattle her bad enough that she won't run well, even if she makes it to the starting line." "Does your father know you're telling me this?" Timothy's face went pale. "No, and if he finds out, I don't know what he'll do. But I can't watch this happen and stay silent. It's wrong, Mr. Ward. Grace deserves better." "You deserve better." Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder, felt him trembling with the weight of his divided loyalty. "You're a good man, Timothy Mercer. Better than your father deserves. Thank you for the warning. We'll figure something out." After Timothy left, Elias shared the information with Jacob and Sheriff Tom Garrett, who'd stopped by to check on the final preparations. The three men stood in Elias's cabin, studying a hand-drawn map of the route to the fairgrounds, working out a strategy. "We move Grace at night," Tom said decisively. "I'll arrange for her to be stabled at the fairgrounds starting tonight. That way Mercer's men can't intercept her on the road. They'll be watching the main route all morning while she's already safely in position. Won't Mercer expect that?" Elias asked. "Maybe, but he can't be everywhere at once, and I'll make sure the stable area is secure." "Official sheriff's business." Tom's expression was grim. "I can't stop a man from racing his horse, but I can damn sure keep the peace and prevent sabotage." "That's within my authority." Jacob nodded approval. "Smart. We'll use a decoy too. I'll take my bay gelding down the main road tomorrow morning. Let anyone watching think that's Grace. By the time they realize their mistake, the race will be starting." They executed the plan that night, moving Grace through darkness to the fairgrounds on the outskirts of Silver Creek. The journey was quiet, almost peaceful, the mare moving confidently despite the unusual hour. Elias walked beside her, one hand on her neck, feeling the steady warmth of her, the solid reality of muscle and bone and breath. Tomorrow she'd either save his life or end it, but tonight she was just Grace, just the horse he'd saved and grown to love like family. Tom secured her in a private stall under guard, 2 deputies who Tom trusted absolutely, men who knew the stakes and wouldn't be bought or intimidated. Nobody gets near her without your say-so, Tom told them. Not Mercer, not his sons, not anyone. Understand? The deputies nodded. They were good men, honest men, the kind who took their oaths seriously. Elias felt some of the tension in his chest ease slightly, knowing Grace would be protected. Back at his cabin, Elias tried to sleep but found rest elusive. He kept seeing different versions of tomorrow in his mind. Grace winning by lengths, Grace losing by inches, Grace injured and never running again. Himself standing in front of his cabin, watching strangers auction off his possessions to pay tax debts. The possibilities branched like lightning, infinite and paralyzing. Finally, he gave up on sleep and sat at his table with Sarah's picture and his father's pocket watch. The watch ticked steadily in the pre-dawn darkness, measuring out seconds that felt both precious and threatening. How many ticks until the race? How many until his fate was decided? "I'm scared," he admitted to Sarah's image, to the memory of her presence that still filled this cabin even 3 years after her death. "Not of losing the land. I could live with that if I had to. I'm scared of letting Grace down, of failing her after she trusted me, of proving everyone right who laughed at that auction, who said I was a fool for thinking a dying horse could be saved." The watch ticked. The darkness outside began to lighten toward dawn, and slowly Elias felt something settle in him. Not confidence exactly, but acceptance. He'd done everything he could. He'd saved Grace's life, trained her well, loved her faithfully. He'd refused to sell her, even when offered wealth beyond his dreams. He'd kept his promises. Whatever happened today would happen, but his conscience was clear. His choices had been made from love rather than fear, from faith rather than desperation. That had to count for something. It had to. Morning came with clear skies and a breeze that carried the smell of turned earth and early autumn. Elias dressed in his father's racing silks. The blue and silver colors faded, but still beautiful, still carrying the weight of history and hope. He tucked the pocket watch into the silk vest, feeling it rest against his heart. Then he walked down to the fairgrounds where the entire town seemed to be gathering. The crowd was larger than anyone had anticipated. Word of the race had spread beyond Silver Creek, drawing spectators from neighboring territories. The story had captured imaginations. The dying horse saved for 50 cents, now racing against the undefeated champion owned by the richest man in the county. It was the kind of narrative that people wanted to witness, regardless of the outcome. Elias found Grace in her stall, calm and alert, showing no signs of the stress that had been planned for her. The deputies nodded to him as he entered, and he spent a long moment just standing with her, his hand on her neck, breathing in rhythm with her breath. "Today's the day," he said quietly. "Everything we've worked for comes down to the next hour. But I want you to know something, Grace. Win or lose, you're already a champion. You survived when you shouldn't have. You trusted when you had every reason not to. That's victory right there, regardless of what happens on that track." Jacob appeared at the stall door, his face serious but not worried. "Time to get her ready. Mercer's here with Ironclad. The race starts in an hour." They prepared Grace methodically, checking her shoes, adjusting her tack, warming up her muscles with gentle exercise. Elias could see Ironclad across the staging area, a magnificent black stallion who looked like he'd been carved from granite and given life. Clayton Mercer stood beside him, surrounded by his sons and ranch hands, projecting confidence that bordered on arrogance. When Mercer noticed that Grace was already at the fairgrounds, his expression darkened briefly before smoothing back into forced pleasantness. He'd been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. But he still had Ironclad, still had a horse that had never lost, still had power and resources and experience. The race itself remained to be won. Mary Abernathy found Elias as the hour approached. She'd organized a contingent of townspeople wearing blue and silver ribbons, showing their support. Doc Brennan was among them, and dozens of others, ordinary people who'd watched Elias's struggle, who'd seen Grace's transformation, who wanted to believe that sometimes the underdog could win. "We're with you," Mary said simply, pinning a blue ribbon to his racing silks. "All of us. You're not alone in this, Elias Ward." The words hit harder than he'd expected, emotion rising in his throat. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as isolated, as facing the world alone after Sarah's death. But here was evidence of community, of connection, of people who cared enough to show up and bear witness. It steadied him, that support. It reminded him that this race wasn't just about him and Grace. It was about what they represented to everyone who'd ever been counted out, ever been told their dreams were foolish, ever been laughed at for trying. Sheriff Tom gathered the crowd as the official start time approached. "Here are the rules," he announced, his voice carrying across the fairground. 1-mile race, straight course through the valley. First horse across the finish line wins. Any interference or sabotage will result in immediate disqualification and criminal charges. This will be a clean, fair race. Everyone understand? His eyes lingered on Clayton Mercer as he said it. Mercer nodded, his face a mask of false good humor. "Mr. Ward, Mr. Mercer, bring your horses to the starting line." Elias mounted Grace, feeling her power coiled beneath him like a spring wound tight. The silk racing colors felt strange against his skin, a connection to his father's past, to a history he'd only learned about recently. He touched the pocket watch in his vest, then gathered the reins. Jacob stood at Grace's head for one final moment. "Remember what I taught you. Hold her back until the final quarter. Trust her to know when to give everything. And Elias, believe. The Silver Wind bloodline has never failed when it mattered most. Grace won't be the first, thank you. Jacob, for everything, thank me by winning." They moved to the starting line, Grace and Ironclad side by side. Two horses representing vastly different stories, but heading toward the same moment of truth. The crowd pressed close on both sides, hundreds of faces watching with bated breath. Someone had stretched a ribbon across the course to mark the start. Another ribbon hung a mile distant, barely visible, marking victory or defeat. The starter raised his pistol. Elias leaned forward slightly, feeling Grace's anticipation, her readiness. This was it. The culmination of months of work, of faith tested against impossible odds, of love proven through persistence. Everything came down to the next few minutes. "Riders ready," the starter called. Elias looked across at Clayton Mercer, saw the man's absolute certainty that he would win. Saw the slight curl of contempt on his lips, the assumption of superiority that had probably never been truly challenged in his entire privileged life. Then Elias looked at Timothy standing in the crowd, the boy's face torn between wanting his father to win and wanting the right thing to happen. Their eyes met, and Timothy gave the smallest nod, approval, encouragement, permission to beat the man who'd raised him but never taught him what honor really meant. "Set," the starter said. Grace tensed beneath Elias, every muscle ready, her breath coming quick and focused. He could feel her heart beating against his legs, could feel the power waiting to be unleashed. This was what she'd been bred for across generations, what had survived war and fire and loss, what had endured starvation and abandonment to arrive at this exact moment. The pistol rose higher. The world seemed to hold its breath. And Elias Ward, who'd once been so poor he'd spent his last 50 cents on a dying horse, who'd lost everything and rebuilt it through faith and stubborn love, whispered one word to Grace that carried the weight of his entire heart. "Run!" The pistol fired. Ironclad exploded from the starting line with the force of a thunderstorm breaking, his massive legs churning earth into dust, his black coat gleaming in the morning sun. Clayton Mercer leaned low over his neck, driving him forward with the confidence of a man who'd never known defeat. Within 3 strides, Ironclad had pulled ahead by half a length. Within 6 strides, a full length separated him from Grace. The crowd roared, the sound washing over the course like a wave. Elias heard it distantly. His focus narrowed to the mare beneath him and the track ahead. Grace had started slower, deliberately slower, just as Jacob had taught them. Her powerful legs moved with controlled rhythm rather than frantic speed, finding her pace, settling into the run rather than exploding into it. "Easy," Elias murmured, feeling her wanting to chase, to close the gap that was opening between them and Ironclad. "Not yet. Trust me, girl." Not yet. The first quarter-mile passed with Ironclad maintaining his lead. 2 lengths now, then 2.5. Mercer glanced back once, his expression confirming what he'd believed all along, that his horse was superior, that this race was already won, that the poor mountain man's miracle was about to be exposed as foolish fantasy. The course ran through valley-bottom land, packed earth that had been cleared and leveled specifically for racing. To their right, the crowd lined the route, a blur of faces and noise. To their left, the open valley stretched toward distant mountains. The air was cool on Elias's face, filled with the smell of horse and leather and crushed grass. Grace's breathing remained steady, despite the pace. Elias could feel her power still held in reserve, could feel her intelligence in how she ran, not fighting him, not panicking at being behind, but waiting for the signal that it was time to show what she really was. This was the silver wind breeding at work. Generations of champions who'd learned that races weren't won in the first minute, but in the last one, halfway point approaching. Ironclad's lead had grown to 3 lengths. Some in the crowd were already celebrating, already counting Mercer's victory as certain. But others remained silent, watching with hope that hadn't died yet, remembering that Grace had survived when everyone said she couldn't. Elias caught a glimpse of Timothy in the crowd, the boy standing separate from his family, his hands clenched at his sides, his face showing the internal battle between old loyalty and new understanding. Beside him stood Mary Abernathy, Doc Brennan, Sheriff Tom Garrett, the people who'd believed when belief seemed foolish. The halfway marker flashed past. 3 lengths behind. Ironclad showing no signs of slowing, Mercer's riding flawless, everything going according to the plan that had worked 3 years running. The undefeated champion pulling away from the challenger, demonstrating the natural order of things, proving that money and breeding and power would always triumph over sentiment and desperation. But then Elias felt it, a shift in Grace beneath him, subtle but unmistakable. She'd been waiting, patient beyond what any normal horse could manage, and now she was ready. Now she was asking for permission to show what lived in her blood, what had survived war and fire and abandonment to arrive at this moment. "All right," Elias said, loosening his grip on the reins just slightly, giving her the signal they'd practiced 100 times. "All right, Grace, now you can run." And she did. It wasn't like her previous speed had been slow. She'd been maintaining a strong pace all along. But what happened when Elias released her was transformation, as if she'd been trotting until this moment, and only now broke into her true gait. Her legs extended farther, her stride lengthened, her entire body seemed to flatten and streamline into pure speed made physical. The gap between them and Ironclad began to close. 3 lengths became 2 3/4, then 2.5. The crowd's noise changed pitch, surprise mixing with excitement, as people realized this race wasn't over yet. Mercer felt it too. Elias saw him glance back again, saw surprise register on his face, saw him begin to drive Ironclad harder, using his crop more frequently, demanding more from a horse that had already given significant effort in the first half of the race. But Ironclad was running on borrowed time now, burning reserves that wouldn't last. He'd spent his power early, the way most horses do, trusting speed alone to carry him to victory. Grace was just getting started, her legendary stamina combined with explosive speed that her breeding had promised, that months of careful training had developed, that Elias's faith had nurtured from the edge of death. 2 lengths, then 1 3/4. The final quarter of the race stretched ahead, and Grace was accelerating while Ironclad was beginning, just barely, but beginning to fade. The crowd was screaming now, all of them, even those who'd bet on Mercer, because they were witnessing something rare and beautiful, the kind of race that would be talked about for generations. The dying horse bought for 50 cents, running down the undefeated champion. The mountain man's miracle proving itself real with every stride, 1.5 lengths, 1 1/4. The final stretch approaching, and Grace running like the wind she'd been named for, like all the champions whose blood flowed in her veins, like an animal who'd been saved from death and decided that life was too precious to waste on anything less than greatness. Mercer's face showed panic now, his crop rising and falling with desperate rhythm, but Ironclad had nothing left to give. He'd run his race, run it well, but he'd been bred for power. Not for this, not for facing a horse that carried the heart of legends. One length separated them as the final 100 yards began, and the race was no longer about Mercer versus Ward, or money versus poverty, or power versus faith. It had become about the horses themselves, two magnificent animals, each giving everything they had, each representing different paths to the same goal, and Grace, who'd been left to die, who'd been worth only 50 cents in a world that measured value in dollars, was faster. 6 months passed like water down the mountain, each day bringing changes that felt both surprising and inevitable. Elias paid his taxes with half the prize money, using the rest to repair his barn, to buy quality hay and feed, to rebuild slowly and thoughtfully rather than rushing into decisions. The cabin that had felt like a tomb after Sarah's death began to feel like a home again, filled with purpose and the daily rhythms of work that mattered. Grace lived in comfort she'd never known. Her stall cleaned daily, her diet carefully managed. Her body kept in excellent condition, not for racing, but simply because she deserved the best care Elias could provide. She'd retired from competition at the peak of her abilities, having proven everything that needed proving, having nothing left to prove to anyone. Jacob Cross became a regular visitor, making the journey from his temporary lodgings in Silver Creek up to Elias's mountain cabin twice a week. They'd formed a partnership of sorts, Jacob sharing his knowledge of silver wind breeding, Elias providing the land and the care, both of them working toward the same goal of continuing a bloodline that had nearly been lost to history. The result of that partnership became visible on a morning in late March when Grace gave birth to a healthy filly, with the same distinctive markings that had identified her mother, the lightning bolt star, the silver dappling, the specific pattern of white socks. New life, continuation, legacy made physical in a wobbly-legged creature who nursed from her mother and looked at the world with eyes full of possibility. Timothy was there for the birth, having earned a permanent place in Elias's life through his integrity and his genuine love for the horses. The boy's relationship with his father remained strained, but he'd chosen his own path with Elias's guidance, learning horsemanship that valued partnership over dominance, care over exploitation. "What will you name her?" Timothy asked, watching the filly with the reverence of someone witnessing something sacred. Elias considered the question, thinking about names and meanings, about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Grace stood protectively over her foal, the mare who'd been dying and was now mother to the next generation. The cycle continuing, hope planted in the earth and growing toward the sun. "Hope," Elias said finally. "Her name is Hope." Jacob nodded approval, understanding the weight carried by that simple word. Hope for the future, hope for the bloodline, hope for all the impossible things that might yet come to pass if people were willing to believe in them. Doc Brennan made his rounds regularly now, checking on both Grace and her foal with professional care that had softened into genuine affection. "Never thought I'd see the day," he admitted during one visit. "That dying horse from the auction is now a mother, healthy and strong, producing the next generation of champions. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, I wouldn't believe it was possible." "Most worthwhile things are impossible," Elias replied. "Right up until someone does them anyway." Mary Abernathy still brought food baskets, though now they felt less like charity and more like the kind of exchange that happened between friends who cared about each other's welfare. She'd become a fixture in Elias's life, her presence comfortable and uncomplicated, filling some of the loneliness that had defined his existence since Sarah's death. They didn't speak of it directly, but something was growing between them, not a replacement for what Elias had lost, but something new and valuable in its own right. Sheriff Tom Garrett visited less frequently, but always with genuine interest in how things were progressing. "Town's still talking about that race," he said during one spring visit. "Probably will be for years. You gave them something to believe in, Elias. That matters more than you might think." Even Clayton Mercer had changed, though subtly and with obvious reluctance. He'd never apologized directly for his attempts at sabotage, but he'd stopped his active hostility. When Elias encountered him in town, Mercer would nod acknowledgement, a tiny gesture that represented significant movement for a man who'd never admitted fault in his life. The public humiliation had taught him something, perhaps, about the limits of power and the dangers of arrogance. Timothy had become the bridge between the two men, carrying lessons from Elias back to his father's ranch, gradually influencing how the Mercer operation treated its animals. It was slow change, the kind measured in years rather than days, but it was real. On an evening in late April, Elias walked to Sarah's grave under the cottonwood tree, where they'd carved their initials so many years before. He carried the blue ribbon from Grace's victory, now faded slightly by time and weather. He placed it at the base of her headstone, alongside the wildflowers that grew there naturally. "I kept my promise," he said to the stone, to her memory, to the part of her that still lived in his heart. "The land is saved. Grace is thriving. I'm living again instead of just surviving. I think you'd be proud of what we've built, of how we chose to believe when believing was hard." The wind moved through the cottonwood branches, and in its whisper Elias heard something like approval, like Sarah's gentle laugh, like the sound she used to make when he'd done something particularly stubborn and good at the same time. He stood there as twilight deepened, thinking about the journey from that auction to this moment. About 50 cents that had purchased a dying horse and somehow saved a man in the process. About faith tested and proven, about love that survived death and found new expressions in unexpected places. About the power of refusing to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only reasonable option. Hope, the filly, whinnied from the paddock below, a sound full of energy and life. Grace answered, her voice deeper, steadier, carrying the authority of a mother and survivor both. And Elias felt something in his chest that had been frozen since Sarah's death finally. Completely thaw. He walked back down to the cabin as the first stars appeared overhead. The same stars that had watched generations of his family work this land, that would watch generations yet to come. The cabin windows glowed with lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney. In the barn, 2 horses stood together, mother and daughter, legacy and future, the bloodline of champions continuing despite everything that had tried to end it. Elias paused at his door, looking back at the valley below, where Silver Creek's lights were beginning to appear, like fireflies in the gathering dark. He thought about all the people down there who'd become part of his story. Mary and Doc and Tom and Timothy and Jacob, and yes, even Clayton Mercer in his own complicated way. Community, connection, the web of relationships that caught you when you fell and celebrated with you when you rose. His father's pocket watch sat on the mantel inside, still ticking away the seconds, still carrying its inscription about believing in tomorrow. Elias had inherited that belief, had nearly lost it, had found it again in the eyes of a dying horse who'd refused to quit. Now he was passing it forward to Timothy, to Hope, to anyone who needed to remember that sometimes the smallest acts of faith could transform the world. He entered his cabin, closed the door against the night chill, and set about making supper. Simple tasks, simple pleasures, a simple life rebuilt from ruins through patience and love. It wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the future he'd imagined when Sarah was alive and their dreams were unbounded by tragedy, but it was a good life. A life with meaning and purpose and connection. A life that honored the past while embracing the future. A life that proved, every single day, that the greatest blessings really did come wrapped in the smallest packages, and that sometimes all it took was faith when everyone else had given up. Outside in the peaceful mountain night, Grace stood watch over her sleeping foal while stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The story that had begun with laughter at an auction had become legend. The kind of tale that would be told around fires and dinner tables for generations to come. The poor mountain man who bought a dying foal for 50 cents, and how that foolish act of mercy had saved them both. How Grace had become the fastest mare in the territory. How love and faith and stubborn determination had triumphed over wealth and power and certainty. How sometimes in this hard world, miracles still happened for those brave enough to believe in them, and how a life could be transformed, utterly and completely, by the simple choice to care for something helpless when caring seemed pointless, to keep promises when breaking them would be easier, to choose hope when despair would be more rational. Elias Ward knew the ending now, knew how the story had turned out. But sitting in his cabin with the lamp burning low and the mountain breathing its pine-scented air through the windows, he also knew that endings were really just beginnings in disguise. Hope was growing in his paddock. Seeds were planted for futures he couldn't yet imagine. And somewhere out there, another person might be facing their own impossible choice. Their own moment of deciding whether to believe or surrender. For them, and for himself, and for the memory of Sarah who taught him that life wanted to live. Elias whispered into the quiet evening, "Choose to believe. Choose to try. Choose love over fear, faith over certainty, hope over resignation. You never know what miracles might be waiting on the other side of that choice." The lamp flickered, the watch ticked, and Grace, who'd been worth only 50 cents in a world that measured value in dollars, stood in her paddock worth more than all the gold in California, not for what she could do or what she'd won, but simply for existing, for surviving, for being exactly what she was, a miracle in horsehide, a 50-cent blessing that had changed everything, a living reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of faith can transform the world. One impossible moment at a time.